Still waiting.
No, it says meeting is now streaming live on Facebook on my screen.
It does?
Yeah.
All right. I don't know. I don't know if we are or not. It tells me it's redirecting us. I don't know if we're live yet or not. Hopefully not. Okay. My other question is why I can't see myself. I could see myself moments ago, and now I can't.
I see you, and it tells me we're streaming live, so
we are. So hello. In a moment, I may appear, but the voice that is disembodied is Martin Dodderwyk. I am the director of the King Institute for Faith and Culture at King University in Bristol, Tennessee. The King Institute was founded in 2007 as the Frederick Buechner Institute for Faith and Culture, and ever since has run an annual speaker series for our students here at King University and also for the area. And this event is part of our virtual series this year as we wait for the pandemic to play out. And we are delighted to have somebody who has actually been here as a speaker for the King Institute before. In 2016, Tim Larsen was here as the Buechner lecturer. Our conversation today has to do with his new book, which is the Oxford Handbook of Christmas, but this is by no means Tim's first book. A graduate of Wheaton College, as well as University of Stirling, where he did his PhD work under David Bebbington. Tim has gone on to teach for many years at Wheaton. He's the author of numerous books, mostly located in the Victorian era, and in general, all around Christian history. It is a delight to have Tim here today to tell us about his new book. I am curious if any of you who happen to be on could tell me if you can see me. We're having some technical issues here going from Zoom to Facebook Live, and I don't know if frankly, I don't know if I'm on. I hope I'm on. So we are, I'm not quite sure what you can see or hear. I'm hoping you can see and hear me.
On my screen, I can see you, and it says live on Facebook in the corner. So we'll hope
that works. That's a good thing. So Tim, welcome back to King in this capacity, and I'm delighted. I have had a chance to look through the book. It is a remarkably weighty book. I was expecting something kind of small, a little Christmas book, a little gift book to put in a stocking, and it's over 550 pages. It's a hefty book. Did you think it was going to be that large when you started out?
Yes, that's the format for a handbook at Oxford. So it's kind of their model. It's really a kind of reference book ambition to cover the whole subject and every aspect. So it is, I knew I was taking on a complicated, ambitious project where you have to herd a lot of world-class scholars together to make it happen.
So you knew it was going to be big. How did the project start to take shape? Can you give us a little of the history of the project itself?
I worked for a long time now with Oxford University Press. I meet with my editor there at least once a year in pre-COVID days anyway. And I know that they like this format of the handbook, and they had always kind of mentioned that. So I kind of rattled it around in my head and tried to think of what would be a big project I would enjoy that would fit my expertise. So because I do Victorian studies, and because the Victorian era is a big inflection point in Christmas studies, I thought I could add to this my own chapter, but then it'd be fun to build this big team around me of musicologists and anthropologists and legal scholars and literary scholars and everyone else. And it would be a nice thing to think about for a few years. So I went for it.
That's good. And it is remarkable how wide-ranging Christmas ends up being. It covers, toward the end of the book, there are chapters in here about legal issues. I was not expecting that. But it turns out Christmas affects everything.
It's over 10% of the year is the Christmas season. And it is by far the world's biggest celebration. So yeah, and people who don't like Christmas especially realize that it's inescapable and relentless.
Yeah. So when you got into the project, it's a large project. I'm curious if you want to start us in the season we're in now. Tell us a little bit about Advent. It seems to me that Advent has gotten swallowed by Christmas.
Yep.
When did that happen? When did that kind of creep occur? And what can you tell us about the distinction between Advent and Christmas?
Yeah, that's a fascinating question. And we've kind of traded in. So we've kind of lost the 12 days of Christmas as well. Almost, even the most zealous Christians don't have the spiritual maturity and discipline to party for all 12 days. We usually, give up and on New Year's Day, starting on diets and resolutions and everything, where really the church is calling us to keep partying for another 6 days if we have the spiritual maturity to do so. So we've kind of moved the party forward. So Advent is intended to be a time of reflection, and one of the themes of Advent, and it's a time of kind of self-discipline and a focus on the return of Christ. So obviously, Christmas is about the first Advent, when God became a human being, and then it points us towards Christ's return, the second Advent, and so that's a theme of that period. So John Henry Newman, for example, so it's kind of the last things is Advent, did a whole Advent series on the Antichrist. Yes, so it was a very different kind of season back then, when you were thinking about these somber things about the end, before you get to Christmas. And then employers often just gave the one day, Christmas Day, and so the season wasn't like we think of it at all. Like, so we have this kind of big buildup, but then it was like you're working. You see that in Dickens' A Christmas Carol, where it's like he's going to work until Christmas Eve, normal time, finish the day, and then he gets one day off.
Right.
And so I think part of our pulling the season forward is a more flexibility with our time and the way that we start to kind of let social activities related to the season and family activities happen earlier than just starting with Christmas Day.
Kind of hard to keep Advent in that context. I want to look a little bit at some of the historical material that you've covered in the book in greater detail. Starting a little bit with the early church. One thing that is a little curious about this as an early church festival is that it's not commemorating a death but a birth. So many of the early church's festivals have to do with the days people die. Why do we have this one as a birth?
Yeah, and that does make it special. First of all, it is a eminently humanly accessible holiday, which I think is why even people who aren't Christians, even grumpy atheists, often kind of get lured into Christmas, because the meaning of a child being born is so life affirming. So the incarnation is a major doctrine of the church. So in some ways, the nativity is also a time to think about that, and the church year is pulling us through major events in salvation history. So obviously the death is already commemorated on Good Friday, but it was a place where we could remember the incarnation as a distinct doctrine, produce a sermon about that, remind people of the theological significance of that truth, as well as Christ's death on the cross on Good Friday and his resurrection on Easter Sunday, the coming of the Spirit on Pentecost, etc.
And this is something that started pretty early in Christian history.
It's definitely clear in the 4th century. And the 4th century is when everything is clear, because that's when the persecution period ends. And so lots of things can become more public, records are better, the church can become more organized and open. So we definitely know in the 4th century that the church is celebrating Christ's birth.
Right. A lot of the ways that we tend to think about Christmas, I think now, we think of as being medieval, whether they really are or not. What can you tell us about the realities of medieval Christmas?
Yeah, so I like to think about what is the space in which Christmas is celebrated. And there are basically 3 spaces that are always in play. One is the ecclesial, a worship service at church. Another is the domestic, the family, in the Victorian kind of ideal, gathered around the fire, the domestic kind of scene of children and parents together, the Christmas tree in the home. But the third space, which we think less about, is the public and the open air. And so the medieval had a much larger space for Christmas to be a public festival with your neighbors. It could be rowdy, it could be loud, there could be fireworks, there could be, banging of pots and drums. So there's this kind of public festival thing, and then we have a little bit of that with caroling. This kind of going door to door is really kind of the community together outside doing something together. I've been thinking about that just this week, hearing Christmas songs played. You have a remnant of it in, bring us some figgy pudding. We won't go until we get some. It's like this mob outside who are like, participating in this public ritual.
Right.
Medieval Christmas also, had gambling, so it kind of has a bit of more like a kind of New Year's Eve kind of quality to it in that rowdiness part. But there's also a big tradition of landlords and aristocrats and wealthier people giving gifts to the poorer people in the community, providing food and public hospitality, drink, putting on plays. So all of those things find their way into our current times through the Victorian period, but they need to morph in various ways as time goes on and society changes.
Yeah. In fact, one of the things that strikes me looking at the chapters in the book is how much this is a layered event. I think that when I go to Rome, if you go to Rome, you realize you're seeing a modern city that also has this 19th century layer, and it has the Renaissance layer, and it has the ancient layer, and they're all there at the same time. And it strikes me that Christmas is a little like that as well. There are medieval elements in what we do. There probably are early church elements in what we do. Do we know much about what the early church celebration of Christmas is?
Yeah, I think that there are similarities. Some of the church fathers are already preaching sermons about excess and worldliness and spending too much money, and so I see it as those things are perennial human instincts. They're the way that all cultures celebrate, including the way that sacred festivals are done in the Old Testament. I've been really interested in Esther chapter 9, where the sacred festival of Purim is established, and it tells you how to celebrate a sacred festival.
Right.
And it says, with feasting, with joy, with giving presents to one another, and giving gifts to the poor. That's how you're to celebrate it. And Jesus himself would have celebrated Purim. And so those elements, I think, are just the human natural thing. You're going to have feasting, you're going to have gifts, you're going to have decorations. And so that's happening in the early church as well. Obviously, it's focused on a worship service. It begins as a day of corporate worship in the church's life, but there is these other elements, and those are both, like I'm trying to say, biblical and human elements for what it means to celebrate a special day.
Yeah. I want to come back in a minute to the Reformation and Victorian eras, and before we move into the more modern context. But on that question, so many of us think of the church element of Christmas being Christmas Eve, and we don't go to church on Christmas Day. Why is that? Because it seems like an outlier to me.
Yes. So in the Roman Catholic tradition and many traditional churches, you should go to church on Christmas Day. But even for the Roman Catholics, there's this tradition of the 3 masses on Christmas Eve. So you actually have put in quite a bit of ecclesial time, culminating in the Midnight Mass, which is a beautiful service that other traditions have stolen. Even Protestants who don't usually use the word Mass, or even say they object to it other times, will often call it a Midnight Mass when they have it. Yeah. So, but the more specific answer to your question is that Protestants, particularly in the Reformed tradition, Presbyterians, Baptists, Congregationalists, and some other dissenting groups like Quakers, objected to the idea of it being a worship service, not on a Sunday. So objected to being a day in the calendar that doesn't exist as a biblical day of worship. But interestingly, they didn't object to the cultural aspects. So I looked into this carefully and read all these ministers who you think object to Christmas, but actually they say, putting up mistletoe and decorations, it's great, it's fine, have a big feast, invite your friends, give gifts. but it's not an ecclesial day in their mind. So they're not going to do the worship service because they think that that is the part that's unbiblical or Roman Catholic. But they're not against the actual domestic Christmas. They're against the ecclesial Christmas, and I think that's part of how it happens.
Well, that takes us into the Reformation era. What happens in that time of upheaval and controversy?
Yes, there definitely is a war on Christmas that starts by Protestants, and I think that is fun to think about today because it might be a Baptist or a Presbyterian who's particularly worried about a war on Christmas today, and yet the original war on Christmas comes from Baptists and Presbyterians and groups like that. So in the Reformation, and they had some points. The church year had gotten really extensive. So there were all of these days where there were special rules. You're not supposed to work, and it had become overdone. And so there was a pruning that needed to be done to make the balance between work and leisure more fitting and commiserate. But there was a group of Protestants. I think of John Calvin as the Grinch who stole Christmas, who really did say this is wrong. Puritans in New England would actually fine people who celebrated on December 25th. Ministers in the Church of Scotland would actually go door to door, making sure nobody was having a good time on December 25th. England went so far as to call it a fast day on December 25th to make sure that nobody could possibly feast. So there really was an aggressive attempt to get rid of it, but it was a tradition that was too popular for that to happen. The people always found a way to come back to it, whatever ecclesiastical and state leadership wanted.
I was in seminary with a friend who was very much devoted to what he called the regulative principle, this idea in the Reformed circles that you don't do anything that's not expressly stated in Scripture. And he told me that the first thing he was going to do when he got into church was to get rid of Christmas. And I talked to him about a year later, and of course, Christmas was not gone. It was going strong at the church, and I think he had adjusted himself a little bit on that front. But it's funny that that's where that starts. And even as you said, in the early church, with that sense of, hey, we've got to hold back on the celebrating a little bit, an earlier phase. Certainly the era that most of us will think of Christmas, by far, all of the majority of our associations come from your era, from the Victorian era. I say your era, you are a year older than I am, but not that old. But the era that you've studied so much is, we think of Christmas as being merry old England, but merry old England is 19th century England, I think, to a lot of us. How, I'm assuming you ran into this in your research before you started this book, or maybe not. How big a deal is Christmas to the Victorian?
So Christmas definitely gets transformed and expanded in the 19th century.
Okay.
Sometimes that is overblown. There's a film you may know of, which is based on a book called The Man Who Invented Christmas, about Charles Dickens. And that book actually says that Christmas was dying out before Dickens, and it was a minor holiday. That's all absurd. It doesn't even make internal sense, because A Christmas Carol is about Ebenezer Scrooge being bombarded by Christmas everywhere he turns. Everybody else is celebrating it enthusiastically. So it's not true that they invented Christmas, but they did transform it and expand it. And as I was talking about the three spaces, the move towards the domestic is really important in the 19th century. And Dickens is important himself. And part of what he does is he tells how to go from that medieval ideal I talked about to a modern industrial urban context. So what's genius about A Christmas Carol is you think of the lord of the manor having to give hospitality to the poor as what Christmas is about, but we're not an agrarian rural society anymore. We're an industrial modern one, and you, whether you're a merchant or a business person or an industrialist, you have responsibilities towards the less fortunate in your society, and you're not pursuing them, and therefore you're not keeping Christmas. So Dickens is able to restage Christmas from the medieval ideal to the modern urban ideal. And a lot of our traditions either come from or gather steam in the 19th century. The
Okay.
Christmas card, for example, was invented in the 19th century. And that's the way I think when you have this, when it's no longer public, it's no longer your neighborhood, but it's domestic, it's your immediate family, how do you keep the connections with your wider social world, your friends and your kind of acquaintances that you know from times past? And the Christmas card is invented as a way of filling that social space. I'm going to have a wider social world beyond the domestic, and the Christmas card is a reminder that maybe I haven't seen you for quite a while, but I remember you fondly, and you're still a part of my life in some way.
Hmm. Again, part of industrial society that pulls people apart. You can work around it.
Yeah, and you also have, for the first time, cheap postage and an efficient postal system, and so you can mass send cards in a way that you couldn't have in the earlier period without it being very expensive and complicated.
One aspect of Christmas charity that we all encounter is the Salvation Army bell ringer. Does that go back to William Booth?
It certainly is from the 1880s, so Booth would have been alive. I think it is the American wing of the Salvation Army that first does it.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, Santa Claus in general is entirely and thoroughly Christian. The spread of everything about Santa Claus is happens overwhelmingly through the churches specifically. So the way that we think of Santa Claus with the reindeer and all of that, that comes from "'Twas the Night Before Christmas," which was written by Clement Moore, who was a professor of Bible at a theological seminary.
Oh,
yes. Yes, Virginia, There Is a Santa Claus was written by Francis Church, who was the religion editor at the Sun newspaper. And I actually looked him up, his obituary. And at his death, there's this long glowing tribute from a minister saying what a godly Christian man Francis Church was. But there's no mention at all of, yes, Virginia, there was a Santa Claus. So he wasn't famous for that yet. Right. He was famous for his Christian identity. If you wanted to buy a Santa suit, you had to buy it through a religious supplies store. That was the only place you can get it, just like communion cups and choir robes and everything else.
Wow.
And then if you wanted to see Santa in person, the only way you did it was at Sunday school. There are several decades where the only place to meet Santa is at Sunday school. And then, of course, the Salvation Army puts him on the streets, ringing the bell, as you've said. But department stores catch up with all this stuff later on. It's really entirely an engine of the churches to spread the fame of Santa Claus. And my theory, and it's based on reading some things, but also connecting some dots, it goes all the way back to St. Nicholas, of course, who was famous for throwing bags of money anonymously, secretly at night through the window of these poor girls to help them out. He gets caught the third time he does this. So
now he's 4th century, is that right?
Yeah, he's a bishop. He actually was at the Council of Nicaea. The evidence is pretty good on that at 325. And so he's famous for giving, but giving anonymously. Oh. And people start to leave notes for the poor, or gifts for the poor, with notes that just say "from St. Nicholas" to remember this way. And then we have this whole Santa tradition of the 19th century I've told you about, where the churches are really pushing it. And the reason is because that's how Jesus told us to give. In the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 6, don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing.
Right.
When you give secretly. And so Christians love the idea of Santa Claus because it's honoring this Christian idea of giving secretly. To give in a biblical way is to be a secret Santa.
Right, right. Huh. So when does the yeah, I'm on a Facebook Live thing. I put up a sign, but there we are. So what we expect with Santa Claus is something very, very different from that. How far back do you trace that secret Santa, a charitable impulse? Is that a 19th century phenomenon, or does it go back farther?
So again, Santa Claus is just a somewhat vernacular garbling of the name St. Nicholas.
St. Nicholas.
And so it seems to be that New Yorkers are hearing Dutch-speaking people say St. Nicholas, and they're trying to repeat it, hearing it in Dutch, and are saying Santa Claus. St. Nicholas becomes one of the most popular saints in the medieval period. So so many churches are named in his honor. He just captures people's imagination. And again, there are lots of stories about St. Nicholas, but the one that captures their imagination is this giving money secretly. And so I think it's in the 12th century where we know that nuns started giving gifts to the poor and signing them as from St. Nicholas.
Okay.
So that's a clear point where we have not just a general approbation of St. Nicholas for doing this and being inspired in a general way, but a particular way of being inspired, which is really use his name as a way of giving a gift anonymously.
Huh. It's a surprising inversion of what we think. I think most of us, that this is the commercialization, and it turns out this is actually a church practice.
Absolutely.
Rather like there was a great piece, I think by Beth Allison Barr from Baylor, about Halloween and the church roots of Halloween, which turn out to be very, very deep. And it kind of upends us a little bit.
Absolutely. So the churches started then creating Santa Claus societies, which were just charities, ways to funnel resources to the poor, and so, yeah, it is, like I say, I think overwhelmingly, almost exclusively might be overstating a little bit, but not that much, the fame of Santa Claus spreads through the churches.
Okay. So that takes us through a little bit of a history that you spend a lot of time on in the book. I want to focus on a few other things about the book in the time that we have. Also, for those of you who are watching, if you have a question, feel free to put it in the comment section. For some reason, I can't see all the comments. There's the book. What a handsome Christmas gift that would make. Would you tell us about the cover?
Yeah, I'm so pleased with the cover. I worked so hard to get it. So it's a Canadian artist who did a whole book setting the nativity scene into Canadian settings. And this is the Holy Family in a kind of construction site. There's a wonderful one with them at a gas station called the Star gas station, which I loved as well. But the way the layout didn't work on the cover because it would block where writing had to be. But I love his work. Kurlik is his name. I would get that right for you. William Kurlik, Kurelek. And I wanted an image that would not be something that you've seen so often before that you don't really actually take it in. You just kind of your eyes roll. So there are wonderful nativity pictures, but they've been used on so many Christmas cards that you can't really see them anymore. You just kind of glance at them and you know them. So I wanted an image you didn't already know. I wanted an image that wasn't, a lot of very white European flesh, like a lot of them are, and so I didn't want to kind of do that ethnocentric thing. But I wanted an image that had a devotional potential to it. Still, I wanted people to actually reflect on the nativity story in a devotional way. And there are some that are just kind of like angry and edgy and kind of like in your face. And I was like, well, I'm not trying to just like make a social statement.
Right.
I'm also want to make a devotional statement.
Right. Related to that, somebody has asked us the question, can you tell us more about the history of the nativity scene, or creche?
Yeah. So, historians are always debunking origin stories. So there's, everything has a prehistory, but it really gets going with Saint Francis. So in the 13th century, and Francis, if you read the whole life of Saint Francis, all the stories about him, he had a huge theatrical streak to him. He had a great sense of public theater. There's the famous scene where he takes off all of his clothes and gives them back to his father in court. It's a very kind of well-staged dramatic scene. And there are a number of stories like that. So Francis figured out the genius of the live nativity scene. He wanted to preach the gospel. He wanted people to come and hear biblical salvation history, the story of the gospel. But he figured out if you have a live ox and ass, if you put live animals there, it's kind of got a novelty and curiosity about it that draws people. And that's still true to this day. Gary Methodist is the United Methodist Church near my house here in Wheaton. And I'm not a United Methodist. I've never gone to that church for a Sunday morning worship service, but for years they would put on a live nativity scene in their basement, and I wanted to know how they got the ox and the ass in the basement to begin with. But we would go because it's like, let's go see the donkey. Why wouldn't you?
Yeah.
So yeah, so St. Francis starts it, and then it becomes a very common Catholic thing to put up a creche scene or a manger scene, that, depending on which country you're in, which of those words you usually use for it, in your home or on your lawn. And Protestants actually are the Christmas tree. So in Germany in particular, it was like originally you're a Protestant family, you have a Christmas tree.
Yeah.
And if you're a Catholic family, you have a manger scene.
Huh.
But of course, one of the great things about Christmas is it's so ecumenical and everybody just steals everybody else's ideas, and it's like the more the merrier. So eventually you get Protestants also have a creche scene as well, and Catholics also have a Christmas tree as well, and so on we go.
Well, what about the Christmas tree? Can you give us a little bit of the history of that?
Yeah, so it doesn't seem likely that it was pagan in origin. It wouldn't matter if it was pagan in origin, and I can give that rant if you want it.
Yeah.
That doesn't matter at all for being Christian. But what actually seems to have happened was that German nationalists in the 19th century made up this backstory of it being pagan in origin because they wanted Christmas to be a dramatic folk holiday rather than a Christian holiday. They didn't want it to be universal and religious and Christian. They wanted it to be about the German nation, particularly the German people. And so they made up this backstory that the Christmas tree goes back deep in German culture in pagan days, but it doesn't. So it seems most likely that its origin is actually from medieval mystery plays.
Oh.
Medieval mystery plays tell salvation history, and they were done at Christmas time, other times of the year as well, other times of the church year, but at Christmas they were done, and they would begin salvation history as you do with creation and fall, so you can move on to redemption in Christ. And that process would include a tree of life being on the stage. The tree of life would even be decorated with communion wafers, unconsecrated communion wafers, and other things would be on the tree of life. And it seems like that idea of at Christmas time seeing a play with a decorated tree inspired people to say, let's have a decorated tree in our home as well, or in our town square. And that's the origin of it. But it doesn't really get going until the 17th century in Lutheran lands. And then in the 19th century is where it becomes widely popular in Britain and America. There are examples before that, but the mass kind of instinct happens in the 19th century in the English-speaking world.
I've heard that attributed to Alfred. Is that correct? Albert.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
So Queen Victoria and Prince Albert. There was a famous illustration in a magazine which showed their family around a Christmas tree with gifts and all of their children, and it was like the royal family, and it was all those things together. It was the domestic thing of the ideal family, and because they had a Christmas tree, it definitely made lots of other people think, oh, that's the proper way to celebrate Christmas because that's the way the royal family is doing it. Obviously, Prince Albert knew that because he was from Germany, and Queen Victoria was raised very German in lots of ways, including speaking German. Not as her only language, obviously, but as a language that she needed to know. And so that image, again, they weren't the first royals to do it even, but that image in a magazine really made it take off as a general popular ideal.
I also, let me remind those of you who are watching, if you do have a question, put it in the comments. I don't want to take all the time myself, but I can. I want to invite that rant. So the question that a lot of us have is Christmas actually pagan? And I think your answer is going to surprise us in some ways.
So that annoys me for multiple reasons. So to kind of cut to the chase, the answer is no, and for so many reasons. One of them is that the things that are considered pagan are just universal human cultural things. So it's just absurd to think that the solstice is somehow a pagan event. You know?
Right.
It's a natural phenomenon. You know,
Right.
all cultures everywhere, however different they are religiously or culturally, have used the sun and the moon to mark time.
Hmm.
Our year is still that way.
Hmm.
In fact, in Genesis 1:14, it says that one of the reasons that God created the sun and the moon was to mark out the sacred seasons. So, Passover is tied to the spring equinox, which is how we date Easter. So it's not at all surprising that Christians would mark out a sacred season with a state, which is a perfectly biblical way of thinking about time, and a cultural, natural way, especially when people are not always literate. It's a way that you can mark time and everybody knows where you're at. And in the same kind of thing, Mary Douglas, the anthropologist, uses a phrase, again, not originally, but she deploys it anthropologically, natural symbols, things that are just like so obvious that cultures everywhere often pick up on them or even just think about them independently. So the symbolic significance of light coming into darkness is there, all over. It's with Hindus in Diwali. It's with Jews in Hanukkah. It's just like, it's a pretty obvious idea. And the same thing, of taking green decorations in winter is a pretty natural symbol. Here is life and hope in a time when a lot of things are dead. So that is a part of it. But then things mean to you what they mean to you. It's absurd to think because pagans once did this, what you're doing is really pagan. It's a non sequitur.
Right.
So my example is the 4th of July. The red, white, and blue are actually the British national colors. My Country 'Tis of Thee is actually the British national anthem, the tune of it. The fireworks were a standard way of celebrating the British monarchy. Handel's music for the royal fireworks, is really kind of gets in the imagination a few decades before the Revolution. Apple pie is a very common ancient English dish. But it would be just, so what all that it tells you is that people celebrate using the cultural resources that they have to hand.
Yeah.
It doesn't tell you that on the 4th of July, you're really honoring the British government and the British monarchy. It's like, so you're not really doing something pagan. You're just doing ways of celebrating that are widely transferable.
Yeah. It's a historical version of backmasked albums.
Yes, exactly.
Somehow I'm actually doing this when I think I'm just listening to this song,
Yeah.
but I'm actually doing something else. That's great. Another question we've got has to do with something that we take very much for granted with Christmas, which is the Christmas Carol. You actually have 2 chapters given to Christmas carols, before 1900 and after 1900. Can you tell us a little bit about the history of the carol and maybe tell us a favorite of yours?
Yeah. So the Christmas Carol reality is fascinating. The second chapter, to me, is the one that really gets me thinking. What he does, Todd Decker is the musicologist who wrote that chapter, as he figures out what is the kind of canonical Christmas rotation for the playlist. And some of those things are songs that are centuries old that still get played regularly. We have a radio station in Chicago here that is just a standard pop station that all year long is just playing the top 40 hits kind of thing. But it goes all Christmas, starting pretty early in November, straight through to Christmas Day. And then you can get a song talking about Christ being the Savior that was written 3 centuries ago, but is being performed on this pop station. And you have also that interesting bit of the canon, which is so where World War II is so important, and the 1940s. So, a song recorded in 1943 will suddenly get played on a station that would never do that any other time of the year.
Yeah.
So I think there are some people, Christians, who fixate on how secular Christmas has become and worry about those kind of things. And to me, it's like I'm startled that these standard commercial pop stations are telling me that a savior has been born, and all of these very explicit gospel messages are being sung on them. And so, I think that the musical tradition of Christmas is actually something that brings a lot of theological and biblical conversation into the mainstream in interesting ways.
Mhm. In what seems to me potentially a fairly loaded question, one of your colleagues has asked, what is a particularly interesting tradition that is revealed in part 7, Christmas Around the World?
All right. Yeah. Um, so if we go like all the way secular, if we use that binary, the one that just most fascinated me was Japan, because it's just so unlike anything I would have expected or ever thought of. So first of all, in Japan, Christmas is much more like our Valentine's Day. It's about romance. It's a big dating day. So
Wow.
that surprised me for sure. And then the other thing that's so surprising about Christmas in Japan is that the traditional standard Christmas meal is Kentucky Fried Chicken, KFC. Yes, and so it's a huge day for KFC. And yeah, and so yeah, that was just like one of those things where like something totally different is happening in another part of the world at the same time, or at least surprisingly divergent.
Right.
If we think more ecclesially, um, another fascinating thing is that the Russian Orthodox follow the Julian calendar still instead of the Gregorian calendar. And so they think that Christmas is on December 25th, just like the West, but that falls on what to us is January 6th.
Yeah.
So it actually is a different day, and that's also fascinating.
Also very convenient for shopping in the after Christmas sales.
Oh, good one.
Save a
Good
lot
tip.
of money doing that. That's a good thing. Um, so what else? That's amazing from Japan. Do you have another example or two for us from the worldwide celebrations?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, um, go and read it is the real advice.
Totally legging.
Yeah, yes, thank you. The Latin American chapter is actually the Latin American and the Caribbean, and it talks about forms of public dance that are part of celebrating Christmas in some Latin American countries, which just sounded exciting and different. You can't really imagine all of your neighbors out on the street dancing. Um, and the Africa chapter, talks a lot about the tension between being away, having to work in a mine or something like that, and family life, and kind of workers separated from their families. So it was really fascinating to think about where you experience this and what it means to you because of those realities.
Hmm. In our context, to come back to the US, we think of Christmas being a time at which consumerism becomes exaggerated. And what do you think is the relationship between Christmas and consumerism as we're in the thick of it right now?
Yeah. So I think that the consumerism critique is a real critique, and it's an important one, and I want to get onto that. But I do want to push back on those who overplay it, I think. So again, I want to say that gift giving is a universal way of celebrating, and it is a biblical way of celebrating. And so I think you have to distinguish between gift giving and consumerism. And what I would encourage people to do is think of ways to gift give that dial down spending too much money, especially spending money that you don't have. And it's just, buying pre-made stuff that maybe people don't want and maybe they don't have anywhere to store. I think if you're dealing with children, you have a separate issue to sort out that I can't help you with. I would just be honest. But for the adults in your life, I think if you sat down and wrote a letter and said, these are 3 things I admire about you, and maybe told a story that said, I saw you do this one time, or when you, in that certain period of your life, I really saw this come out of you, they would value that much more deeply and truly than anything you could buy from a store or in a store. Yeah. And they could store it very easily. It's not, it has to find some big place in the garage or somewhere to keep it all year round.
Right.
So I think keep up gift giving, but certainly dial down spending more than you can afford, and this kind of thoughtless, just I've got to find stuff to transfer to people who probably don't actually want or need more stuff.
Yeah. Even better than the letter with the three things would be a letter with three things I admire about you, plus a copy of the Oxford Handbook of Christmas.
Smoothly
That would
done.
be really the best option there. Part of our cultural baggage, I guess, or the way that our culture takes on Christmas at the moment includes Christmas movies. I'm curious about how they showed up in the book, and do you have a favorite?
Yeah, there's a whole chapter in the book on film and television.
Okay.
Because another whole big thing is the Christmas special on
Yeah.
television, and for television shows and for celebrities run specials. So that, and it's become an ever bigger genre. It's a genre that I love. I don't have any rules, but I can't watch Christmas movies outside of November and December, maybe the early January. And the same with Christmas music. I love Christmas music. And again, it's not a rule, it's not a principle. It's just, I just don't want it the rest of the year. But I love it, and I take it attentively during the year. So obviously, It's a Wonderful Life is the best Christmas movie ever in my view. But the one that I maybe is my second, and which that people don't know about as much, is The Bishop's Wife, which I love. Which is David Niven and Cary Grant, and it just gets to me every year. It's fun and delightful. It's great scenes. Every scene works, but it also has that kind of Christmas tug and heart about what do you really value in life and why, which is kind of like the quintessential message of a good Christmas movie. And it actually, if it's a little too, if you're the kind of person who says I don't like black and white movies and I don't like old movies, it was remade as The Preacher's Wife with Denzel Washington and Whitney Houston, and the remake is actually great as well. It also has great funny lines and changed some scenes in ways that freshen them, and I like them both. That's what I'm saying. And so if you're looking for new ones, you don't know those, try The Bishop's Wife or The Preacher's Wife.
That's great. One question that came in from somebody is, for you as an author, once this goes to paperback, does it matter to you in how one would buy the book, like Amazon or a bookstore, or does that make a difference to you?
Oh, nobody has ever asked me that.
There you go.
So, it doesn't, I'm not trying to make money on the book at all. I don't make much money, and it doesn't matter to me. So it doesn't matter in that way, in the least. Both literally, it doesn't change anything, but also I don't care about it. I use Amazon all the time, so I'm not an anti-Amazon person, but I do worry about their over dominance. I also use a local independent bookshop in my town all the time. And I deliberately think, if I have enough time, if I don't have to get it within a week or whatever, even if I do, I'll ask them first, do you have a copy in the shop? And if so, how long would it take to get it in? And I support them regularly and deliberately. So I do not want Amazon to follow up everything else, but I'm not an anti-Amazon purist. But yeah, do what's right for you and convenient for you, and that's totally fine.
That's good. That's the Christmas spirit. Another listener question. Can you tell us about the usage of Christmas versus an Xmas? Xmas versus Christmas.
Yeah, that's just a Greek letter, standard shorthand for saying Christ by Christians in the early church. So it is not an Xing out of Christ. It is a notation for Christ that is an ancient Christian way of noting Christ. And some of those things, you would be part of putting in the margins of manuscripts. So you need to have shorthand in order to say things within the room you have. So that's another thing you don't need to worry about.
That's good. What about going a little broader? You talked about the war on Christmas earlier, which is a phrase we hear a lot. To what degree is Christmas is part of American culture wars now? In your book, it turns out it's been a culture war in a lot of places at a lot of times. You want to comment about the that nature of Christmas as a battleground.
Yes, so we have talked about the Puritan and Reformed critique of Christmas and even banning of Christmas at various points. So that's one inflection point in that. And it does tie in with anti-Catholic concerns. So the other half of the Xmas is the Mass, and there are Protestants who object to the word Mass being used. But then Christmas has its own problems in aggressively secular countries. So one of the fascinating things was the communist countries tried very hard, communist Russia, to stamp out Christmas. Again, unsuccessfully. Christmas always wins in all of these battles, is the short, clear answer from the historian. They actually created a new character, so they didn't want St. Nicholas around, or probably obviously not Jesus, but not even St. Nicholas. So they created a new character who they called Grandfather Frost. And they tried to introduce a mythological character to kind of fill the void at the same time for the winter festival with Grandfather Frost, but it didn't take off. The Nazis, rewrote Silent Night to be about Hitler, and were quite anti-Christian in lots of ways, but again couldn't get rid of Christmas, and so tried to Nazify it in various strange ways. To this day, Muslim countries, there are varying degrees of freedom. There are countries that will fine you if you wear a Santa hat, and so there are, so you have that same tension. But on the other hand, the prime minister of Iraq gave a beautiful greeting to his Christian citizens on Christmas or for Christmas a few years ago, and it makes sense because Muslims also believe in the Virgin Mary, and so there isn't a theological parting of the ways over Christmas for Muslims and Christians, the way there are some other doctrines and some other claims of the Christian faith. But yeah, secular context, some Muslim context, and then Puritan context and Reform context are all points at which there have been wars on Christmas.
I think it's a national holiday in Senegal, if I'm remembering correctly, which is it's like a state holiday. Toward the end of the book, you have the big summing up chapter. After these huge swaths of material on history and on culture and on theology, and we come to the end, and it's your job to sum this all up. What do you come away saying is the meaning of Christmas?
Yeah, so I write up a fairly short meditation at the end, and my goal in that piece is to get rid of this bullying tone of Christmas doesn't mean that, or it can't mean that, or if you knew the origin of that, you couldn't do it anymore, or you shouldn't do it anymore. So the kind of like what I say at the end is Christmas means to you what you want it to mean to you, what you choose it to mean to you. And we should just actually think about it as a time for peace on earth rather than war. I know that's a strange original idea, but I came up with it all by myself. And and so why do we have Christmas? I don't say that explicitly, but the implicit is Christmas wars, for goodness sake. This is, in one of the remarkable things that happens in Christmas history is the Christmas truce of 1914 in the First World War. And the hierarchies on both sides, British and the German, as well as the French on the British side, had given explicit orders that there would be no truce. The truce was completely in defiance of military orders, but it bubbled up from the ranks because they could not imagine killing somebody on the day when the Prince of Peace was born. And so I try to spread a little piece of goodwill at the end and say, if you're a devout Christian, even things that might seem secular to other people, you experience them through your faith and you see them through your faith. That's what I was trying to do with Santa Claus. Santa Claus, if you're a follower of Jesus Christ, can be a way of giving anonymously like Jesus taught us to do. It doesn't have to mean that to somebody else, but it can mean that to you. And vice versa. People who are secular, they're kind of impervious even when they're singing Silent Night or something that's pretty explicitly Christian. And for them, it just becomes something cultural because that's who they are. And so Christmas is what you choose it to be, and it means to you what you choose it to mean, and you should pursue the things that matter to you with confidence.
Hmm. When you look back over the book, what's something that surprised you?
That's a delightful question as well. I guess one of the things that surprised me is how everything starts to blend together.
Yeah.
That what I tried so hard is to say, here is, for example, if I just think of the worshiping communities section, here's a Catholic way of experiencing Christmas. Here is a Protestant way of experiencing Christmas. Here's an Anglican way of experiencing Christmas. Here's a Lutheran way of experiencing Christmas. All those chapters are there, but in truth, they all blend together because all the other traditions like what the other ones are doing. So Catholics come up with the midnight mass, but all kinds of Protestants are like, wow, a Christmas Eve midnight service, what a great idea, and they steal it. Anglicans come up with this beautiful service called Lessons and Carols, where you kind of rotate between reading passages of scripture that tell the salvation story throughout history, salvation history, and singing carols. And all kinds of other Christians are like, that's a great service, let's do it. And they love it, even though they're not Anglican, and on you go. And so Christmas seems to me eminently ecumenical. And that's true kind of in the biggest cultural sense as well as the specific ecclesial sense. Christmas traditions just find a way of migrating, and you find that you're doing something that somebody might say, well, that's Swedish or whatever, and your family's not Swedish, but you still do it because it's migrated, and that kind of thing happens all the time with Christmas.
Yeah, I think anybody's Christmas tree that I know is full of that mixing and blending, and it's a nice thing. It indicates some peace. I'm reminded of the end of Yaroslav Pelikan's great book, Jesus Through the Centuries. And I can't remember the beginning of the sentence, but his final phrase is, and now he belongs to the world.
Yeah.
And that seems to me a little of the phenomenon with Christmas too.
Yes, absolutely.
This is something really that becomes universalized. Tell us a little bit about the Larsen Christmas. What happens at your home?
So we have a live Christmas tree every year, and the ritual is always the same. We get the Christmas tree from the same place, which is Marmion Abbey, which is a Benedictine monastery not too far away from us. And they have a Christmas tree farm. We always buy our tree from them. The rule of St. Benedict actually explicitly says that you can't sell something above market price. So you can get a good deal from the Benedictines. If they're honest Benedictines, which they are, you can always trust them for a good deal. And we love doing that. And like many other families, all year long, when we go on vacation or special trips for a conference or whatever, we try to pick up an ornament, Christmas tree ornament, to remember that by. Our children have very successfully learned this. And so they've gone all kinds of places around the world that I've never been to. My two oldest children have both been to Asia and Latin America. I haven't been to either. And they dutifully bring back, my daughter went to Thailand for a semester-long study abroad and brought back an elephant with a Christmas stocking on one of its feet. And we have that ornament. So we put the ornaments up and we look at them all through the season. We remember pleasant times that we've had together or experiences that one or more of us have had. And I love that.
That's good. And maybe you could have some Kentucky Fried Chicken.
Yeah, not another day, but getting towards it. It might work good.
It's a good warm up. Yes. Good. Just to let people know, if they are interested, the book is still hardback, and it will be rather pricey. Even if you buy it from the Benedictines, it's going to come at a pretty high price. When do you think it might come out in paper? Do you have any idea?
Well, of course, this is all a psychological game, because the more people who buy it in hardback, the quicker it comes out in
right,
paper.
Right.
I think probably a year and a half. But
okay.
But they kind of like to sell out or come close to selling out the print run from the hardback, and then they do a paperback that's cheaper.
And it is available digitally as well.
It is available digitally, and encourage your library to buy it, whether it's a local public library or a university library or whatever.
Yeah. And a book, I mean, from my perusal and from what you've said, something that is great for a public library. There's a good amount of theology and Christian history. There's also a lot about cultural analysis and general history there. I think it's a very widely relevant and applicable volume. I hope it will see great success.
Thank you so much.
What is your next project?
So probably why I gave you that little story about the Christmas truce is because I'm currently working on Anglican chaplains in World War One.
Oh,
And I'm doing kind of more of a life biography, group life biography of a cohort of Anglican clergymen who served as military chaplains in the First World War. And because I know the Victorians so well, and they're all raised and trained as Victorians, and then they had this momentous modern experience that is so often seen as the kind of the thing that transfers us into the modern period in some ways, this breaking point into the modern sensibility in so many ways. So I wanted to watch kind of closely up close people live that experience and how they changed, what they tried to preserve from how they thought before the war, how the war changed them, what they thought before the war, whether the war actually was what they did after the war, those kind of things.
that's great. Well, that'll keep you off the streets.
Yes.
In the meantime, that's a good thing. Well, thank you very much to those of you who have watched. One or two of you gave me very helpful technical support along the way, and I'm grateful to them as well. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you, Tim, and to see you again after a couple of years, I guess. And we'll hopefully get you back here in person at some point to come talk to us at King.
I've enjoyed it. Thank you so much, Martin.
Thank you, and thank you the rest of you, and we'll hopefully see you in the new year. Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.
There's the book. Right. Now if I can figure out how to turn it off.